Alright, so here we are in Maya. In the second part we will cover all the geometry work that was done in Maya and the exporting of that in Fusion and texturing process in Fusion, and that probably would be enough to talk about in the second video, and then we'll finish it most likely in the third video. Alright, so you have seen these two images. They are applied to these two cameras. So the first step was to create a camera inside of Maya, and the standard camera is 35mm when you create it, so I had to change that to match the all the attributes of my real camera. So the focal length, I changed to 20, the f-stop I changed, and also I changed the film back of the camera to match that with the real camera that was used for the footage. So here is camera 1 and camera 2, and this is camera 1. So the way I did this is I created the camera, which by default goes to 000 space value X, Y, and Z, and then I moved the camera manually in the Y direction to roughly around 330, and that was based on some calculation as to how high I must be from the ground level when I took the picture. And I simply just did number of floors in the building where I was standing times I don't know, 8 or 10 feet per floor, plus some margin of error and some space between the two floors, and then that put me roughly where I wanted to be in the 3D space. So I applied this image to that camera first, right, and that's fairly easy. You just go select the camera, go to import image. I mean, right now we are in perspective, so it will import image for the perspective, but when you are selecting this camera, it will apply to that. Then I created a copy of this camera just by Control D, duplicate, and that by default came camera 2. I applied another image, or replaced the image that was applied to the first camera with this second image. Now both cameras were exactly at the same location, because other than Control D I hadn't really done any changes to the angle. But I knew that this picture is my camera is rotated more downward compared to this one. So I manually started adjusting that, still in the perspective view, and when I was roughly satisfied that this is how it must look, by looking at these two images. But obviously that is not enough. What you need to do is look at any one of the two cameras. So let's look at camera 1, and when you look through this camera, you see that the building is cut off here, because this is the end of the image plane for camera 2. That's the one that we have selected. We are viewing through one, and that building is continuing up in image 1. So I had to fine-tune these values here for camera 2 until both image planes showed that the building continues. It didn't really take that long, maybe 10 minutes max, and I was done. And now if you look through camera 2, you clearly see the same thing happening here. You have the building that is continuing from camera 1, because this is the image plane of camera 1 now, and it's continuing down into image plane of camera 2, and that is happening everywhere here also. So then I knew that if I create a geometry, it would be completely aligned in both views. So let's just look at building 5, for example. So here is building 5, that is the middle building here. If I remove the shaded view, and if I select building 5, you can see that it's aligned to the image in camera number 2. So now let's change it to camera 1, camera 1 here, and you can see that it's still aligned. And this would happen with every building, because we have aligned the image planes and the camera, more importantly, perfectly with all the rotations and translation. So that was the very first step that I made in Maya. So now that we have done that, I can go in making all these buildings, and that's just pure geometry work. If you look at all these buildings, they are just pure boxes, polygonal boxes, and no real details, because we are not going to create any geometrical work, we are going to project the image. So there was nothing done here. Some of this you could easily make in Fusion also, but because I was going to come back to Maya for some effect work, I decided to make those buildings in Maya. Now you see some of the buildings, they kind of look broken with a lot of vertices, and these are the DMM objects, and we'll work through that also, this DMM module, and you know how it was used for the real physics inside of Maya, but that is to come. And then I created this point of impact where the actual braking will take place for both buildings, one here and one here. And these are just simple locators, just to know which point in space are going to use to emit particles and all those things. So they just serve as a visible point in the space. That's all. Some of the light work is purely for effect work. I didn't need lighting for the geometry itself. It's directional light here and there, but that's for the shadow and all those things that I also need to think about when I build any additional particle or debris or things like that. Right, so don't worry about this camera yet, because this is the one that I mentioned in Fusion that I had to export a camera out of Fusion to bring back in Maya, and that's what this is. This is the FBX that I was talking about, but it is the film cam, and it's moving exactly how the camera is moving in Fusion. Okay, so let's go back to Fusion from here, and we'll see how these buildings were then projected upon, with the images, and also how some of the missing buildings were brought in by using simple image planes and very primitive geometry. Because if you look at this building here, that's in the front of this building, that's missing. These two buildings are, I think, there, but one of them is missing, I believe. This building in the back is missing, right? Because you have this building here, but there's nothing for this building. So we'll look at that. Yeah, so that's all there is in Maya for now. We'll definitely come back for all the effect work. So let's go back to Fusion. Okay, so here we are in Fusion. Let me just bring a couple of viewports so we can see what's happening. Yeah, we'll have to manage through this real estate space here, but I'm sure we'll do fine. Right, so let's look at this part first, which is the very first thing I did. In Fusion, you just go to File, Import, and 3D Scene, and in 3D Scene you go back to the folder where all the FBX work is done and import that in here. And that's all that you see here, most of it. I mean, there are some image planes and stuff like that that I have done in Fusion, but most of geometry work was done in Maya. So we want to see that first. Now, if I bring this node here, you don't see anything, and that's because all the geometry here has projections coming from all this camera, and as soon as you project something using texture projection, you don't see that in the viewport here until you bring the projection node. So what we'll do in the meantime is select all these sketcher nodes, which are the nodes taking in projections, and we'll disable them, or in Fusion it's called pass through. So Control P will pass through that. Now we do need light to see the shaded part of the geometry, and you see where these buildings are exactly where you would expect them from what you have seen in Maya. Here is 0, 0, 0 space, and here are the buildings. You have some more than what you saw in Maya. You have an image plane here to capture that front building, this building. Then you have image plane here to capture this building here in the back. You have the image plane for the ground and one for the back buildings, which you probably can see in the second image if you look at this one. Oh, sorry, the first one, I guess. Yeah, all these buildings that you see in the back, they are projected on these image planes. Because of the camera move, I had to widen this area here and For that I used the clone tool in Fusion to make more buildings which would cover all the field of views continuously in FilmCam. Okay, so base geometry here, nothing really special about that. So all of these will connect inside of this merge node with some more geometry work which was done in Fusion, and these are just the image planes for this part. For example, I needed each individual part, individual objects to have a separate place for projection. Because of the camera move, I cannot take this box here. Let's zoom in to see what I'm talking about. I cannot take this box and apply that onto a flat image plane. This I could, but not this box, because when the camera goes down, you will see that this geometry will not hold its shape, and it will flatten, and it wouldn't look really nice. So a lot of this work here you see is for individual parts of this building. There is one other thing that I want to talk about, and that is the way this Sketcher tools are set up. So you have the FBX here, right? So here is the first building. I call it building number 1, and this building number 1 has material applied to that, and in this case it's Blinn. I could have connected Sketcher directly to FBX, but whenever you have texture projection and you are also going to use lights in the scene, in my experience you cannot combine both of them without having a material node to respect the effect of the lights. So I brought Blinn, and I have taken down the specularity here, because these are not shiny objects, just very flat. And then to that is the Sketcher node. The Sketcher node here has a projection ID or projector ID. In this case it's 1. If you move on to the next one, it's 2. If you go to the next one, it's 3, and so forth. There is a reason for that, and I'll show you that in a minute as to how it was used. You probably have already seen part of this in other videos if you have watched my previous 3D discussions. But let me just bring this live. So Control P again to remove the pass-through. Okay, so this time, because all these FBX models are going into this node here, let's examine that one. Okay, so now you see all the buildings with projections, right? So you can see, now let me remove the light here so we can brighten the image a little bit. Same object, same FBX. You see the boxes here that I was talking about, these boxes. This image plane here is receiving image of the back building, which is this one here. The ground plane is taking image of all the water, and I haven't really done the elevation work for the bridge and things like that, because I don't think that our camera move, at least for the purpose of doing this tutorial or discussion, really would justify building the whole bridge and vehicles and everything. And you see the buildings in the back here that are also projected. Now you see some additional paintwork that is done here. There are two aspects of that. One, paintwork I need to reveal the building that is hidden behind this building, for example, because when the camera moves and you see the windows of the lower part of this building, then you need to create them, because original image didn't have that. So if you look at here, I have done quite a bit of paintwork to clone some of these windows down here, so that when the camera moves you can see that. And what I mean by that is, here is the image without the cloning, and then if I take this one here, which is the paint node, you see that I have created these windows again in the lower part. And then I noticed that there is some leftover water that wasn't completely taken out in Photoshop, so I then applied the paint node to take that out. Now one thing to keep in mind is that all these images are basically the same PSD file. In the Format tab you can split the layers that you have in Photoshop, and whichever building that you need, you can If you have named them properly in Photoshop, then you can just use those layers here. So that's one aspect of the paint job, which is just to reveal what I'm going to see when my camera moves, and also to do the set extension for what you see here, the water, for example. I needed the water extended quite a bit. I didn't have enough water to really continuously show something in the back when you only have this much to work with, right? And in the whole image. So a lot of paint work was applied to that to create the coverage area where my camera will require some sort of a background. With that, when you do this clone or this kind of set extension, and particularly in our case because we are using two images with two different exposure levels, you always need to think about how are we going to equate these two images. So if you look at this image here, this is from camera 1 and this one is from camera 2, and these are the two buildings that I was referring to earlier. But you see that there is clear difference in the exposure settings. In Fusion there is a workflow through color correction node that you can equate the exposure levels. Just before that, let's walk through this paint node, which is just to remove the edge, to just take that out, and that's out here, and you can see here also, so we'll take that out as well, right? And then the color correction node. Now let me remove this for now. Here is color correction node, and it still doesn't really show the difference between the two. Now what I had done is if you apply what you want to match this exposure to into here, right, then software will match the exposure curves to equate these images, and also give you control, if you wanted to brighten or darken the image. So that helped a lot because I had two exposure settings, and I didn't think about that when I was taking the picture, but Fusion helped me out there quite a bit. So again, so that's the first part of paint job. But the second part is all this damage work that you see here, the paint work here to show the damage. And again, that's here is the image, and just pure color painting using brush strokes and to create something like this. Where it becomes interesting is actually in this building. So you saw this node, right, to remove this edge, but then I was also going to have part of the building that would be breaking when the impact takes place. So for that, what I did is I applied another paint node here. You don't see anything here, but if you go to the frame where the impact is going to happen, which is I believe 305 or so. So let's start with 302, and as you scroll you see that something is developing here, right, and from nothing to a damaged corner. And this part was done using animation on the strokes. So if you look at the modifier here, you see the opacity of the stroke. I mean, I just did the stroke here. I erased this part of the building and then applied some colors that I wanted to see the burnt part of the corner, and I just animated that opacity so that it would go from 0 to 1 over the course of this few frames, and that also is happening here. So all the strokes that I needed animation, I did so by applying animation to the opacity and some other values. So all that goes into this projection or the projector, and if you look at these projectors where I have used the projection system of texture, there is a projector ID. Here it says 32 because that's what I must have used, I guess, for that particular flow here. But if you look at this one, it would say 1, and this one would say 2, this one I think would say 3, and so forth. So each projection ID or projector ID is then matched with each of the catcher tool, so that they would catch a particular projector. And that's the reason why I have all these so many projectors taking different part of the image to apply to different part of the geometry. You have the same geometry created here twice, so you have building 1 here once, and then you have building 1 here again second time, and one is catcher 1, one is catcher 2 in terms of the projector ID, and it is taking both images of camera 1 and camera 2. So this image here and this image here, it's taking both of these and applying it on the same geometry. So because the camera is moving beyond this point down below and above this point, I needed to have both of the parts covered. So that's the way I worked around that. You see that I have kind of created a detour here for these two buildings, so it's the same building. And what I'm doing is I'm feeding these two projectors also into this 3D merge node, and there are other things coming in. Let's look at them in a minute, but then I'm rendering whatever that I'm feeding here. Now, how am I rendering? What am I taking in here? Well, one thing is this film cam. This is the camera that we created in Fusion, and we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. And that camera is coming in to this merge node, which is then rendered, right? Now, because I am using the same projector, I also needed the FBX, so I have also branched out the same FBX model for that building. So why am I doing this? This one is giving me just this building that I'm separately rendering through my camera. So the actual camera that was used, the film cam, is just taking this building separately as a render, and that render is then, because it is a 2D image through the same film cam that I would use for the rest of the project, it gave me ability to create a mask, and this mask then was applied to something that was coming down from the other pipe here, which is a render of the flame. So if you look at this one here first, what you see is these are the flames of Hunter Killer that is going to be behind the building. So I need to hide this until that Hunter Killer comes out in 3D space. So the way I did that is by creating a mask, and the mask is going to hide this when you go to the appropriate frame. So when you go to frame 190 or so, you don't see the particles because they are masked out. So let's look at here. There are no particles, but the particles are still there in the shot. I don't want to see them until when this Hunter Killer comes out of the building area. And as you go to, let's say, frame number 205, 6, and then it comes out somewhere around here. So now if you look at that through the masked area, you see that one engine is out, but the other one is not out yet. And as you go forward further, you see the second one is showing up. And that building, presence of building, I needed for this render. Now, why did I do this render separately, even though I had 3D particles for Hunter Killer? Well, I wanted to have glow and blur applied to those particles, and I cannot do that in 3D environment. I had to render them out. And once I render them out in a 2D image, but then I'm also going to apply that to the 3D part of this object that you will see, I really needed to work with the masking a lot. So that's what this mask achieves. Alright, so let's go over to the film camera first, and then we'll stop and go over to the rest of the comp. This is same camera as one of these two. I don't even remember at this point whether I used camera 1 or camera 2 as copy of these two camera. And then I created this film cam knowing exactly how I wanted this applied through the Photoshop work that I showed you. I then moved this camera into the 3D space first. So if you look at this space here, right, if you look at this space here and look at this camera, that's the film cam, it's moving through the timeline exactly how I wanted it moved. And I didn't do one frame at a time. I just had animated or the keyframe frame 0, then I keyframed frame number 120, and then I keyframed the last frame. Now normally you would see that other than those frames, which would be green, everything else would be blue, but here you see everything is green as if I animated every frame. And also if you go to the graph editor, you see that every frame has a keyframe, and that's because I baked the animation. Normally I don't do that, but I needed this camera out of Fusion and into Maya, and one way that I know that is the easiest for me is to bake animation, and for that there is a script that you can use. A couple of scripts. There is one that's called Fusion to Maya Cam, and this one I was not able to use because it's written with a different version of Python than Python that I'm running in Fusion. But there is one that came with Fusion, I believe, and that was bake animation. The only problem with bake animation is that it only bakes one channel at a time. So if you're doing X, Y, and Z, and then X, Y, and Z of rotations, you would need to do that 6 times, bake that 6 times. So every time you choose a different value. So for example, if you say bake animation, this window will open up and says X offset, and you would have to do one at a time, each one of these. It's it makes it a time-consuming process, but since the other one didn't work for me, I had no choice. But it was okay. It didn't take that much time. Yeah. So and then I applied export FBX tool, rendered the whole thing, the whole project, because you have to do the saver node also in order to get the FBX file. Created the FBX of this camera and then took that in Maya. So let me just demonstrate how I did that. So film cam, I selected that and control spacebar, FBX exporter, it's already there. Or you can just try typing whatever the phrase that you know, let's say BX, so it will find anything with BX. In this case it's FBX exporter. So click OK, project folder, Terminator, and in there I have FBX. And so then when you render it, it will render with all these properties. So let me just delete that because I don't need that now. Right, so so that's where we are. Let me stop here, and we will go from here to let's see, we'll go back to Maya and start working on the all the effects work, and then we'll come back and see how this 3D geometry for Hunter Killer was brought in. Okay, thanks a lot.